Picture this. A German princess walks into 18th century Russia and decides she's going to completely revolutionize an empire, seduce half the nobility, collect more lovers than most people collect coffee mugs, and casually become one of history's most powerful rulers. While everyone whispers scandalous stories about her bedroom habits, Catherine the Great didn't just rule Russia, she owned it, flaunted it, and left behind a legacy so gloriously complicated that historians still blush when discussing her personal life. But here's the thing everyone gets wrong about Catherine. The real scandal wasn't her love affair, it was how a foreign-born woman completely outmaneuvered every Russian man in the room and built an empire that would make modern CEOs weep with envy. Think you know royal drama? Buckle up, because Catherine's story makes reality TV look like a church service. Let's start with a truth that'll make you rethink everything you thought you knew about destiny. Catherine the Great was never supposed to be great at all. Hell, she wasn't even supposed to be Catherine. Born Sophie Friederike Ilgosti in 1729, she was just another German princess in a continent absolutely crawling with them. Think of it like being an influencer in 2024, except your currency was marriage prospects instead of follower counts. Picture 14-year-old Sophie, packing her bags in the tiny Prussian court of Anhalt-Zerbst. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was basically the original helicopter parent, except instead of hovering over college applications, she was orchestrating international marriage alliances, like some sort of diplomatic chess master. The target, Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, who by all accounts was about as charming as a wet sock and twice as useful. But here's where Sophie showed the first glimpse of the steel spine that would later bend an empire to her will. While most princesses of her era were trained to be decorative furniture with a pulse, Sophie was devouring books like they were going out of style. Philosophy, literature, political theory. She consumed knowledge with the hunger of someone who suspected she'd need every advantage she could get. And boy, was she right. The journey to Russia in 1744 reads like a medieval road trip from hell. Imagine bouncing across frozen European countryside in a carriage that makes today's budget airlines look luxurious, knowing you're traveling toward a marriage that's essentially a business merger where you're the commodity being traded. Most 15-year-olds today stress about high school presentations. Sophie was heading toward a lifetime fulfillment where failure meant exile, disgrace, or worse. When she finally arrived at the Russian court, the culture shock must have been like stepping into an alien civilization. The Russian court was a bizarre fusion of European pretension and Orthodox tradition, where Byzantine protocols met Versailles fashion sense, and everyone was perpetually drunk on power, vodka or both. Empress Elizabeth, Peter's aunt and Russia's current ruler, was a woman who collected ball gowns like Pokemon cards, and had opinions about everything from foreign policy to hemlines. But Sophie adapted with the fluid intelligence of someone who understood that survival meant evolution. She threw herself into learning Russian with an intensity that impressed even her tutors, studied Orthodox theology until she could debate priests, and most cleverly of all, she watched. She observed the complex web of court politics, noting who held real power versus who just looked pretty in fancy uniforms. The conversion ceremony where Sophie became Catherine was theatre at its finest. Picture the scene, incense thick enough to choke on, chanting that seemed to echo from another century, and a teenage girl publicly abandoning not just her name, but her entire cultural identity for a chance at a throne that wasn't even guaranteed to be hers. It was the ultimate long-term investment strategy, betting everything on a future that existed only in her imagination. And Peter? Oh, Peter was exactly as advertised, a man-child obsessed with toy soldiers and Prussian military drills, who seemed to view his future bride as just another diplomatic inconvenience. Their wedding in 1745 was less romantic union and more corporate merger, complete with international observers and enough political subtext to fill a library. Catherine walked down that aisle knowing she was marrying not just a person but a dynasty, a country, and a destiny she'd have to create for herself. What makes Catherine's early years so fascinating isn't just her ambition, it's her patience. While Peter played with his toy armies and alienated potential allies with his pro-Prussian sympathies, Catherine was building relationships, learning languages, and most importantly, learning how to be Russian in a way that her husband never bothered to attempt. She understood something that modern politicians still struggle with. Authenticity isn't about where you come from, it's about how completely you commit to where you're going. If you think modern relationships are complicated, Let's talk about Catherine's marriage to Peter, a union so spectacularly dysfunctional that it makes celebrity divorces look like fairy tale endings. Imagine being stuck in a relationship where your partner is obsessed with toy soldiers, openly prefers his mistress, and occasionally threatens to have you arrested for treason. Now imagine that this relationship is also your job, your public identity, and your only path to power. Welcome to Catherine's world for the first 17 years of her adult life. The wedding night alone deserves its own historical footnote for sheer awkwardness. Peter, apparently more interested in showing Catherine his collection of miniature Prussian uniforms than in any conjugal duties, spent their first evening as a married couple, explaining military formations. Catherine, who had prepared for this moment like students prepare for finals, found herself married to a man who treated their union like an extended sleepover with someone he found mildly annoying. But here's where Catherine's genius started to show. Instead of sulking or staging dramatic confrontations, she adapted. She became the perfect court wife in public, while privately building the intellectual and social foundations that would later support her coup. Think of it as the ultimate long game. While Peter alienated nobles with his erratic behavior and obvious contempt for Russian traditions, Catherine was making herself indispensable to the very people who would eventually choose Russia's future. The court during these years was like a reality TV show written by Machiavelli and directed by someone with a serious alcohol problem. Empress Elizabeth ruled with a combination of genuine political skill and legendary vanity. She reportedly owned over 15,000 dresses and forbade any other woman at court from wearing the same color she chose for any given day. Catherine navigated this environment like a chess grandmaster, learning to read the subtle signals that determined who was rising, who was falling, and who held actual influence versus ceremonial titles. Meanwhile, Peter was busy being Peter, which is to say he was systematically alienating everyone who might have supported him. He made no secret of his preference for all things Prussian over Russian, conducted mock military exercises in their private apartments that kept the entire palace awake, and showed about as much diplomatic sense as a caffeinated toddler with access to international treaties. Catherine watched her husband's political suicide attempts with the fascination of someone studying a masterclass in how not to inherit an empire. The question of heirs became a diplomatic crisis, wrapped in personal humiliation. For 9 years, Catherine and Peter produced no children, leading to whispers that ranged from speculation about medical issues to outright accusations of political incompetence. In a world where a woman's primary value was measured in her ability to produce male heirs, Catherine found herself in the impossible position of being blamed for her husband's failures while being expected to somehow magically solve them. When Paul was finally born in 1754, the circumstances surrounding his conception were diplomatically murky and personally devastating. Empress Elizabeth immediately claimed the child as her own heir, effectively kidnapping Catherine's son and raising him as a future emperor while treating Catherine like an inconvenient birth mother. Imagine having your child taken away moments after birth and being told you can visit him according to a schedule determined by your mother-in-law, who also happens to be your boss, landlord, and the person who controls your entire future. Catherine's response to this systematic humiliation reveals the psychological steel that would later reshape an empire. Instead of breaking down or lashing out, she doubled down on self-improvement. She read voraciously Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, absorbing Enlightenment philosophy like someone studying for the world's most important exam. She corresponded with European intellectuals, building relationships that would later prove crucial to her international reputation. And most cleverly of all, she began to understand that her foreignness, initially seen as a liability, could become her greatest asset. Because while Peter remained psychologically German, Catherine was becoming authentically Russian in ways that impressed even skeptical nobles. She learned to speak Russian without an accent, studied Orthodox theology with genuine interest, and most importantly, she listened to complaints about the current regime with the sympathetic ear of someone who shared many of their frustrations. She was positioning herself, not as Peter's wife, but as Russia's potential salvation from Peter's inevitable reign. The court began to notice. Conversations that once politely included Catherine out of obligation began to center on her insights. Foreign ambassadors started reporting that the Grand Duchess showed more political acumen than the Grand Duke, and slowly, carefully, the idea began to circulate that perhaps Russia deserved better than what genetics had provided in Peter's inheritance. Now we arrive at the part of Catherine's story that makes historians blush and gossip columnists weep with envy. Let's talk about Catherine's love life, not because it's scandalous, though it absolutely was, but because it reveals something fascinating about how a woman wielded sexual autonomy as political power in an era when such things simply weren't done. Catherine didn't just take lovers, she collected them like a Renaissance patron collected art, with careful consideration, genuine appreciation, and an eye toward how each acquisition enhanced her overall collection. First, let's address the elephant in the room: the horse rumors. No, Catherine the Great did not die in a sexual encounter with a horse. This persistent myth tells us more about how history treats powerful women than about Catherine's actual preferences. The horse story was likely invented by her political enemies as the ultimate character assassination, because apparently when you can't defeat a woman politically, you create bestiality rumors. It's the 18th century equivalent of deep fake revenge porn, and it's stuck because people love believing the worst about women who dare to be powerful. The reality of Catherine's romantic life was far more interesting than any fabricated scandal. Her first serious affair was with Sergei Saltykov, a handsome courtier who may or may not have been Paul's biological father, a question that adds delicious ambiguity to the entire Romanov succession. Saltykov was chosen with the tacit approval of Empress Elizabeth, who was apparently more concerned with producing heirs than with maintaining the fiction of Catherine's marital fidelity. It was politics disguised as passion, or perhaps passion disguised as politics. With Catherine, the two were often indistinguishable. But it was Grigory Orlov who truly introduced Catherine to the intoxicating combination of love and power. Orlov was everything Peter wasn't: charismatic, genuinely Russian, politically astute, and blessed with the kind of masculine confidence that made grown women reconsider their life choices. Their affair began around 1760 and lasted over a decade, producing not just personal happiness for Catherine, but also crucial political alliances that would prove essential during her eventual coup. The Orlov brothers, there were 5 of them, and yes, Catherine had romantic connections with more than one, represented a new model of Russian nobility. They were self-made men who had earned their positions through military service and political skill rather than inherited them through accident of birth. Catherine's relationship with this family signaled her preference for merit over pedigree, a philosophy that would later revolutionize Russian governance. Then came Grigory Potemkin, and suddenly we're talking about one of history's great love stories, disguised as a political alliance. Potemkin wasn't just Catherine's lover, he was her intellectual equal, political partner, and possibly her secret husband. Their relationship lasted over 2 decades, and produced some of Catherine's most significant achievements, from military victories, to territorial expansion, to administrative reforms that modernized Russian government. The Potemkin relationship illustrates something crucial about Catherine's approach to power. She understood that personal relationships and political success were inseparable. Potemkin wasn't chosen despite his political utility. He was chosen because of it. Catherine had learned that in a world where women's political power was always conditional, surrounding herself with competent, loyal men who owed their positions to her favor was the most effective way to maintain control. What modern observers often miss about Catherine's romantic history is how revolutionary her autonomy actually was. This wasn't a woman sneaking around having affairs despite her political responsibilities. This was a woman who refused to separate her personal desires from her political ambitions, and somehow made both work in her favor. She chose partners who enhanced rather than threatened her power, maintained relationships that served multiple purposes, and never allowed romantic attachment to compromise political judgment. The later lovers, Zavodovsky, Zorich, Korsakov, Lanskoy, Ermolov, and finally Zubov, weren't just pretty faces or political conveniences. Each relationship represented a different phase of Catherine's reign and revealed different aspects of her character. Some were chosen for their youth and beauty, others for their intelligence or political connections. Catherine approached love like she approached everything else, strategically, enthusiastically, and entirely on her own terms. Critics then, and now, have focused on the number of Catherine's lovers as evidence of impropriety, but they're missing the point entirely. In a world where male rulers routinely maintained multiple mistresses without comment, Catherine's romantic life was revolutionary, not because of its scope, but because of its transparency. She refused to hide her desires, or pretend that powerful women should be sexually invisible. She claimed the same romantic freedoms that men had always assumed, and she did it so confidently that even her critics had to respect her audacity. The real scandal of Catherine's love life wasn't moral, it was political. By choosing partners based on personal preference rather than dynastic advantage, by maintaining relationships that served her interests rather than traditional expectations, and by demonstrating that a woman could wield sexual autonomy as effectively as any other form of power. Catherine was rewriting the rules of female sovereignty in real time. Every great empire has its hold my beer moment. And for Russia, that moment came in 1762 when Catherine decided that watching her husband destroy the country was less appealing than, well, not letting him destroy the country. What followed was a masterpiece of political maneuvering so elegant that it makes modern election campaigns look like amateur hour at the local community theatre. Empress Elizabeth's death in January 1762 finally put Peter on the throne. He'd been preparing to inherit for his entire adult life, and immediately proved that some people are better suited for preparation than performance. Peter III's reign lasted exactly 186 days, which is roughly the same amount of time it takes most people to realize they hate their new job. Except in Peter's case, his job was running the largest country on earth. The new emperor's first acts read like a case study in political suicide. He immediately ended Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War, not through negotiation or strategic withdrawal, but by essentially giving Prussia everything they wanted, because Peter had a fanboy crush on Frederick the Great. Imagine if a new American president decided to end a major conflict by just handing over Alaska because he really admired the opposing leader's military uniforms. That's essentially what Peter did, and Russian nobles were about as thrilled as you'd expect. But Peter's foreign policy disasters were just the opening act. He then announced plans to reform the Orthodox Church along Lutheran lines, because apparently alienating the military wasn't enough. He needed to add religious leaders and their congregations to his growing list of people who wanted him gone. It was like he was working through a checklist titled How to Unite Your Entire Country Against You in Record Time. Catherine, meanwhile, was playing the longest chess game in history, while Peter was busy dismantling centuries of Russian tradition with the subtlety of a caffeinated bulldozer. Catherine was quietly positioning herself as the reasonable alternative. She attended Orthodox services with visible devotion, expressed concern about Russia's military reputation, and most importantly, she listened sympathetically to the complaints of increasingly frustrated nobles, military officers, and church officials. The conspiracy that eventually overthrew Peter wasn't hatched in shadowy corners by ambitious plotters. It was practically gift-wrapped and delivered to Catherine by her husband's spectacular incompetence. The Orlov brothers, her lover Grigory, and his siblings provided military connections and logistical support. Princess Dashkova, one of history's most underrated political operators, handled noble coordination with the efficiency of a modern campaign manager. Catherine herself served as the ideological center of a movement that barely needed to articulate why Peter had to go. His actions spoke louder than any manifesto. The actual coup began on July 9, 1762, and unfolded with the kind of smooth precision that makes Hollywood heist films look chaotic. Catherine, supposedly visiting her summer palace for health reasons, was secretly meeting with key conspirators while Peter remained at his own palace, blissfully unaware that his empire was being reorganized around him. It's the political equivalent of your employees having a company-wide meeting to discuss your replacement while you're in another room playing video games. When the military units in St. Petersburg declared for Catherine on the morning of July 9, it wasn't a rebellion, it was more like a collective sigh of relief. Regiment after regiment switched sides with the enthusiasm of people finally getting permission to do what they'd wanted to do for months. Peter's support evaporated so quickly that by afternoon, he was essentially emperor of whatever building he happened to be standing in at any given moment. The psychological warfare Catherine employed during those crucial hours reveals her sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. She didn't just seize power, she performed legitimacy. She appeared before troops in a modified guard's uniform, symbolically claiming the role of Russia's protector. She issued proclamations that positioned her coup not as a grab for personal power but as a patriotic rescue mission for Russian sovereignty and Orthodox tradition. Peter's response to learning about his overthrow was characteristically pathetic. Instead of fighting back or attempting to rally supporters, he essentially had a breakdown and started writing increasingly desperate letters, asking if he could please keep some of his toy soldiers. The man who had just inherited the largest empire on Earth was negotiating for permission to maintain his hobby collection. It would be funny if it weren't so historically significant. The formal abdication came on July 17, just 8 days after Catherine's coup began. Peter signed away his throne with about as much resistance as someone returning a defective appliance to customer service. He was promised comfortable retirement, a generous pension, and permission to marry his mistress. It seemed like a civilized end to an uncivilized reign. Of course, it wasn't really the end. A week later, Peter was dead under circumstances that were diplomatically described as natural causes, but which everyone understood differently. Catherine claimed no involvement in his death, and modern historians generally believe her, but the timing was certainly convenient. Dead emperors can't change their minds about abdicating, can't inspire restoration movements, and can't complicate international recognition of new regimes. With Peter gone, Catherine faced the delicate task of transforming a successful coup into a legitimate reign. She had seized power through military force and political maneuvering, but keeping power would require something much more sophisticated. She had to convince Russia and the world that a German-born woman could be more authentically Russian than the native-born emperor she'd displaced. Here's where Catherine's story gets really interesting, because this is the part where a German princess who stole a throne through military coup decides she's going to reform an entire empire using French philosophy. It's like if someone overthrew the government and then announced they were restructuring society based on their favorite TED Talks, except Catherine actually had the intelligence, power, and sheer audacity to make it work. Catherine's correspondence with Voltaire alone deserves its own miniseries. Picture the scene: the most powerful woman in the world, exchanging witty, intellectually sophisticated letters with Europe's most famous philosopher, discussing everything from religious tolerance to judicial reform, to the proper way to educate peasants. Voltaire called her the Semiramis of the North, comparing her to the legendary Assyrian queen, and Catherine responded with letters so charming and insightful that the old philosopher fell completely under her spell. But Catherine wasn't just name-dropping Enlightenment thinkers for political credibility. She was genuinely attempting to apply their theories to the practical business of running an empire. Her Nakaz, or Instruction of 1767, was essentially an attempt to create a new legal code for Russia, based on Enlightenment principles of justice, rationality, and human dignity. It was 52 articles of carefully reasoned legal philosophy, applied to everything from criminal punishment to economic policy, and it was revolutionary enough that several European governments banned its publication as dangerously radical. The Legislative Commission Catherine convened to discuss her proposed reforms was like an 18th century version of a constitutional convention. Except instead of a few dozen wealthy white men, Catherine included representatives from virtually every social class and ethnic group in her empire. Nobles sat alongside merchants, military officers debated with peasant representatives, and Catherine herself presided over discussions that ranged from abstract philosophical principles to practical questions about tax collection and criminal justice. Of course, applying Enlightenment ideals to Russian reality proved more complicated than translating French philosophy into Russian law. Catherine discovered what every reform-minded leader learns eventually: the gap between theoretical perfection and practical possibility can be measured in light years. The Legislative Commission dissolved after 2 years without producing a new legal code, but not because Catherine lost interest, rather because she realized that meaningful reform required changing not just laws but the entire social and economic structure that made those laws necessary. Take serfdom, for example. Catherine understood perfectly well that Enlightenment principles of human dignity were incompatible with a system that treated the majority of her population as property. She corresponded with philosophers who assumed she would abolish serfdom, wrote privately about its moral problems, and even drafted proposals for gradual emancipation. But she also understood that Russian nobility's entire economic and social position depended on serf labor, and that attempting immediate abolition might trigger the kind of civil war that would destroy any possibility of gradual reform. So Catherine chose the path of incremental progress, which history judges as either pragmatic wisdom or moral cowardice. Depending on your perspective, she limited the conditions under which people could be enslaved, restricted nobles' authority over their serfs' personal lives, and encouraged voluntary manumission through economic incentives. It wasn't the dramatic moral gesture that Enlightenment philosophy demanded, but it was practical progress in a system where dramatic gestures often produce dramatic backlash. Catherine's approach to religious tolerance reveals the same tension between ideals and implementation. She genuinely believed in Voltaire's arguments for religious freedom, and worked to reduce persecution of religious minorities throughout her empire. She welcomed Jewish settlers, protected Muslim populations in newly conquered territories, and generally pursued policies that made Russia more religiously diverse and tolerant than most European countries of her era. But she also understood that religious tolerance had to be balanced against political stability. When Pugachev's rebellion erupted in 1773-1774, partly fueled by Old Believer religious grievances, Catherine learned that tolerating religious diversity while maintaining imperial unity required constant diplomatic balancing. She had to appear orthodox enough to maintain legitimacy with traditional Russians, while seeming enlightened enough to satisfy European opinion and her own philosophical convictions. The contradiction at the heart of Catherine's reign was that she was trying to implement Enlightenment ideals through autocratic power. She genuinely believed in reason, tolerance, and human progress, but she also knew that meaningful reform in 18th century Russia required the kind of centralized authority that Enlightenment thinkers theoretically opposed. She had to be an enlightened despot, which is roughly as logically consistent as being a democratic dictator. What made Catherine's philosophical experiment work, to the extent that it did work, was her intellectual honesty about these contradictions. She didn't pretend that implementing Enlightenment ideals in Russian reality would be simple or that her own power was somehow exempt from Enlightenment critiques of arbitrary authority. Instead, she approached reform as an ongoing experiment in applied philosophy, constantly adjusting her methods while maintaining consistent goals. Her critics, both contemporary and modern, argue that Catherine's Enlightenment credentials were mostly performance art, that she corresponded with philosophers for international prestige, while governing like any other 18th century autocrat. But this criticism misses the genuine innovation of Catherine's approach. She was the first major European ruler to take Enlightenment philosophy seriously as a governing methodology, rather than just as intellectual decoration. If you want to understand how Catherine earned the title Great, forget the love affairs, and the philosophical correspondence focus on the map. During her 34-year reign, Catherine expanded Russian territory by 200,000 square miles, which is roughly equivalent to conquering modern-day France twice. She didn't just inherit an empire, she built one, and she did it with a combination of military brilliance, diplomatic cunning, and sheer strategic audacity that makes modern geopolitics look like amateur hour. The First Russo-Turkish War, 1768-1774, began almost by accident, the way many great historical events do, through a series of small incidents that escalated beyond anyone's initial expectations. The Ottoman Empire, encouraged by France and Austria, who were nervous about growing Russian power, decided to test Catherine's resolve by making demands about Russian influence in Poland. Catherine's response was essentially, "Hold my tiara and watch this." What followed was 6 years of warfare that redrew the map of Eastern Europe and established Russia as a major European power. Catherine's generals, Rumyantsev, Suvorov, and others, proved that Russian military reforms had created an army capable of defeating the once feared Ottoman forces in open battle. More importantly, Catherine demonstrated that she could coordinate complex military campaigns while managing domestic politics, international diplomacy, and administrative reforms simultaneously. The naval victory at Chesme in 1770 deserves special mention because it was so audaciously improbable that it reads like historical fiction. Catherine sent a Russian fleet from the Baltic Sea around the entire continent of Europe to attack the Ottoman navy in the eastern Mediterranean. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Imagine coordinating a military operation that required sailing halfway around the world with 18th century communication technology. The fact that it worked, and that Russian ships completely destroyed the Ottoman fleet in the process, announced to European powers that Catherine's Russia was playing at an entirely new level. But Catherine understood that military victories were meaningless without diplomatic follow-through. The Treaty of Kuchik-Kanaka in 1774 wasn't just a peace agreement, it was a masterpiece of strategic positioning disguised as diplomatic settlement. Catherine gained control of the Crimean Peninsula, secured navigation rights through the Black Sea, and most cleverly obtained the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. That last provision was the diplomatic equivalent of planting a time bomb. It gave Russia justification for future intervention in Ottoman affairs whenever Catherine found it convenient. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 showed Catherine at her most strategically brilliant. Rather than simply conquering the peninsula through military force, she orchestrated a complex diplomatic campaign that made annexation seem like the natural result of Crimean political evolution. She supported Crimean nobles who favored Russian protection, provided economic incentives for voluntary integration, and timed the formal annexation to coincide with international events that distracted potential critics. It was geopolitical manipulation at its finest. Catherine made conquest look like liberation, made expansion appear as defensive necessity, and made territorial acquisition seem like humanitarian intervention. Modern politicians study her Crimean campaign as a textbook example of how to achieve strategic objectives while maintaining plausible deniability about aggressive intentions. The Second Russo-Turkish War, 1787-1792, was Catherine's victory lap, the conflict where she proved that her earlier success hadn't been beginner's luck. The Ottoman Empire, supported by Britain and Prussia, who were increasingly concerned about Russian expansion, attempted to reverse their earlier losses and restore their position as the dominant power in the Black Sea region. Catherine's response was to unleash a military campaign so overwhelmingly successful that it redefined what European powers considered possible in terms of rapid territorial conquest. Grigory Potemkin's role in these campaigns reveals another aspect of Catherine's strategic genius, her ability to delegate authority while maintaining overall control. Potemkin wasn't just Catherine's lover, he was her military alter ego, the person who could implement her strategic vision with the kind of aggressive creativity that made enemies underestimate Russian capabilities. Their partnership during the southern campaigns was like watching two chess grandmasters play as a team, individually brilliant, together unstoppable. The famous Potemkin villages story, whether historically accurate or not, illustrates how Catherine's enemies tried to diminish her achievements by suggesting they were somehow artificial or theatrical. The idea was that Potemkin had constructed fake settlements to impress Catherine during her tour of newly conquered territories, making expansion appear more successful than it actually was. But even if the story were true, it would demonstrate Catherine's genius for understanding that political perception is often more important than administrative reality. Catherine's expansion wasn't just about adding territory to maps, it was about fundamentally altering Russia's relationship with European power dynamics. Before Catherine, Russia was a large but peripheral power, influential in regional politics, but not central to European calculation. After Catherine, Russia was indisputably one of Europe's great powers, a country that had to be consulted on major international decisions, and whose interests had to be considered in any significant diplomatic arrangement. The human cost of this expansion was enormous, of course. Wars killed thousands of soldiers and civilians, displaced entire populations, and drained resources that could have been used for domestic development. Catherine understood these costs and accepted them as the price of achieving her strategic objectives, but she never pretended they didn't exist or weren't morally significant. What made Catherine's empire building different from simple military conquest was her understanding that lasting expansion required more than just winning battles. She invested heavily in developing newly acquired territories, encouraged settlement and economic development, and worked to integrate diverse populations into the Russian administrative system without completely destroying local traditions and loyalties. Every great ruler faces a moment when their authority is fundamentally challenged, when the carefully constructed edifice of power suddenly looks fragile, and the distance between empire and anarchy can be measured in the time it takes for news to travel from the provinces to the capital. For Catherine, that moment came in the form of Emelian Pugachev, a Don Cossack with delusions of imperial legitimacy and just enough charisma to convince thousands of desperate people that he was actually Peter III, miraculously returned from the dead to reclaim his throne. The fact that anyone believed Pugachev's impersonation tells you everything you need to know about the state of rural Russia in the 70s. This wasn't a sophisticated deception. Pugachev looked nothing like Peter III, had none of his mannerisms, and couldn't even maintain consistent details in his fabricated biography. But for serfs, Cossacks, religious minorities, and other marginalized groups throughout the empire, the literal truth of Pugachev's identity mattered less than what he represented, a chance for revenge against the system that had made their lives systematically miserable. The rebellion began in September 1773 among the Yayak Cossacks, a semi-autonomous military community that had been gradually stripped of traditional privileges by Catherine's administrative reforms. Pugachev appeared among them, claiming to be the true emperor, complete with fabricated stories about his escape from assassination and his years in hiding. Within weeks, his following grew from a handful of disgruntled Cossacks to thousands of rebels representing virtually every group that had grievances against Catherine's government. What made Pugachev's movement so dangerous wasn't its military strength, though at its peak, it controlled territory larger than most European countries, but its ideological appeal. Pugachev promised to restore traditional Cossack liberties, free the serfs, eliminate noble privileges, and return Russia to an imagined golden age, where social relations were supposedly more just and authority was more legitimate. It was revolutionary nostalgia, the kind of backward-looking radicalism that promises to solve modern problems by returning to a past that never actually existed. Catherine's initial response reveals both her political sophistication and her occasional blind spots. She understood immediately that Pugachev represented more than just another provincial uprising. He was channeling decades of accumulated resentment against her reforms, her foreign birth, and her challenge to traditional Russian social hierarchies. But she also initially underestimated how deeply that resentment had spread and how effectively Pugachev could mobilize it into organized resistance. The rebellion's early successes were genuinely terrifying for Catherine's government. Pugachev's forces captured major fortresses, defeated regular army units, and controlled vast territories in the southeastern part of the empire. More ominously, the rebellion was spreading not through military conquest, but through voluntary adherence. Communities were choosing to join Pugachev's cause, suggesting that the discontent was broader and deeper than Catherine had realized. But Pugachev's movement also revealed its fundamental weaknesses. As it grew more successful, the coalition of Cossacks, serfs, religious minorities, and frontier communities that supported him had conflicting interests that could be temporarily unified around opposition to Catherine's government, but couldn't be permanently organized around any coherent alternative program. Pugachev promised everyone everything, which worked as revolutionary motivation but failed as practical governance. Catherine's counteroffensive combined military suppression with sophisticated political warfare. She deployed experienced generals who had proven themselves in the Turkish wars, but she also launched a propaganda campaign designed to undermine Pugachev's legitimacy claims and highlight the contradictions in his revolutionary program. She positioned herself not as the foreign usurper fighting against popular will, but as legitimate authority defending civilization against chaotic violence. The capture and execution of Pugachev in January 1775 ended the rebellion, but began a period of serious reflection for Catherine about the sources of political discontent in her empire. She couldn't dismiss Pugachev's support as simple ignorance or manipulation. Too many people had joined his cause for their grievances to be entirely illegitimate. She needed to address the underlying conditions that had made his rebellion possible, while maintaining the authority and social order that made effective governance possible. Catherine's administrative reforms, following the Pugachev rebellion, reveal her capacity for learning from political challenges without abandoning her fundamental objectives. She reorganized provincial government to improve communication between central authority and local communities, increased opportunities for social mobility within the existing hierarchy, and generally worked to make autocratic rule more responsive to popular concerns without becoming less autocratic. The rebellion also influenced Catherine's approach to social reform in subtle but important ways. She couldn't abolish serfdom. The economic and political obstacles remained too formidable. But she could and did work to limit the conditions under which serfdom operated, and to create alternative paths for individual advancement. It wasn't the dramatic change that Pugachev's followers had demanded, but it represented genuine improvement within the constraints of what was politically possible. What makes the Pugachev rebellion historically significant isn't just its immediate impact, but what it revealed about the tensions inherent in Catherine's entire reform project. She was trying to modernize Russia while maintaining traditional authority structures, to implement Enlightenment ideals while preserving autocratic power, to expand individual freedoms while strengthening imperial control. Pugachev's rebellion showed how these contradictions could explode into violence when they reached critical mass, among populations that had nothing left to lose. Catherine survived the rebellion, not just because her military forces were eventually superior, but because she learned from it in ways that made future similar uprisings less likely. She never solved the fundamental contradictions in her reform program, but she managed them more skillfully, understanding that successful autocracy required not just the power to compel obedience, but the wisdom to make obedience seem preferable to the available alternatives. While Catherine was busy conquering territories and suppressing rebellions, she was simultaneously orchestrating a cultural transformation that would make St. Petersburg the intellectual and artistic rival of Paris and Vienna. This wasn't accidental. Catherine understood that lasting imperial greatness required more than military victories and administrative efficiency. She needed to create a cultural legacy that would outlive her political achievements and establish Russia as a civilization worth emulating rather than just a power worth fearing. The Hermitage collection began as Catherine's private obsession and evolved into one of the world's greatest art museums. but the story of its creation reveals Catherine's sophisticated understanding of how cultural patronage functions as political power. She didn't just buy art, she strategically acquired entire collections that enhanced Russia's international prestige, while satisfying her genuine aesthetic preferences. When she purchased the Crozat collection in 1772, she wasn't just acquiring beautiful objects, she was announcing that Russia could compete with any European power in terms of cultural sophistication. Picture Catherine walking through her private galleries in the Winter Palace, surrounded by works by Rembrandt, Rubens and Watteau, discussing artistic techniques with visiting European intellectuals, while conducting informal diplomacy among masterpieces that most people would never see in person. The Hermitage wasn't just a museum, it was a diplomatic tool, a statement of cultural ambition, and a reflection of Catherine's genuine belief that beautiful objects could inspire noble thoughts and elevate human consciousness. But Catherine's cultural patronage extended far beyond collecting existing masterpieces. She commissioned new works from the greatest artists of her era, turning the Russian court into a laboratory for artistic innovation. The palace interiors created during her reign, the Amber Room, the Jordan Staircase, the throne rooms with their impossible combinations of Baroque excess and neoclassical restraint, weren't just decorative spaces, but architectural arguments about the nature of imperial power and aesthetic possibility. The intellectual ferment Catherine encouraged in St. Petersburg during the 1770s and 80s created a genuinely cosmopolitan cultural environment. Russian nobles who had once looked to Paris or Vienna for intellectual stimulation found themselves hosting salons where European philosophers debated with Russian writers, where scientific discoveries were discussed alongside artistic theories, where the latest French novels were analyzed next to newly translated ancient Greek tragedies. Catherine herself was often the center of these intellectual gatherings, not as a ceremonial presence, but as an active participant, whose contributions were valued for their insight rather than just politically acknowledged. Because of her rank, foreign visitors consistently noted her ability to discuss literature, philosophy and art, with the expertise of someone whose opinions had been formed through genuine study rather than superficial exposure. The founding of the Free Economic Society in 1765 exemplifies Catherine's understanding that cultural development required institutional support rather than just individual patronage. The society brought together Russian and European intellectuals to study practical questions about economic development, agricultural improvement and social reform, but its real significance was as a model for how systematic intellectual inquiry could influence government policy and social development. Catherine's own writing deserves recognition not just for its political significance but for its literary merit. Her plays, particularly The Deceiver and The Deluded, were sharp social satires that used comedy to criticize social pretensions and moral hypocrisy. Her memoirs, though incomplete and occasionally unreliable as historical sources, reveal a literary voice of genuine wit and psychological insight. She wasn't just a ruler who wrote, she was a ruler whose writing demonstrated the intellectual qualities that made her effective governance possible. The architectural transformation of St. Petersburg during Catherine's reign created a physical environment that embodied her cultural aspirations. She commissioned Bartolomeo Restrelli, Charles Cameron, and other architects to design buildings that would rival Versailles in magnificence, while expressing distinctively Russian imperial themes. The result was a cityscape that visitors described as uniquely beautiful, combining European architectural sophistication with Russian imperial grandeur in ways that created entirely new aesthetic possibilities. But Catherine's cultural revolution wasn't limited to elite circles in St. Petersburg. She established public schools, encouraged the development of provincial theatres, supported the translation of European literature into Russian, and generally worked to create conditions where cultural development could occur throughout her empire rather than just at court. She understood that lasting cultural change required broad participation, not just aristocratic patronage. The emergence of a distinctly Russian literary voice during Catherine's reign reflects her success in creating cultural conditions that encouraged intellectual confidence and artistic experimentation. Writers like Denis Fonvizin and Gavril Dergevin developed literary styles that drew on European models while expressing uniquely Russian perspectives and concerns. They wrote for Russian audiences about Russian themes, but with technical sophistication that could compete with any European literature. Catherine's cultural legacy is complicated by the same contradictions that marked her political achievements. She created conditions for intellectual freedom while maintaining political censorship, encouraged artistic innovation while controlling its political implications, and promoted cultural development while ensuring it served imperial purposes. But these contradictions shouldn't obscure the genuine achievements of her cultural patronage or the lasting impact of the intellectual environment she created. The cultural transformation Catherine orchestrated during her reign established foundations for the flowering of Russian literature, music, and art that would make the 19th century a golden age of Russian culture. Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, and other giants of Russian culture built on institutional and intellectual foundations that Catherine had established. Her cultural revolution made possible the artistic achievements that would eventually make Russian culture globally influential in ways that military conquests alone could never have accomplished. Behind every great cultural flowering lies a carefully managed economy, and Catherine's Russia was no exception. While she was busy collecting art and corresponding with philosophers, Catherine was also revolutionizing Russian commerce, agriculture, and manufacturing with the same systematic intelligence she applied to military conquest and cultural patronage. The result was an economic transformation that funded her imperial ambitions while creating the material foundations for the cultural achievements that defined her reign. Catherine inherited an economy that was essentially feudal. Vast agricultural territories, worked by serf labor, limited manufacturing, minimal foreign trade, and a financial system that would have looked familiar to medieval administrators. By the time of her death, she had created a genuinely modern economic structure that could support sustained military campaigns, fund massive construction projects, and maintain the kind of court that impressed European visitors accustomed to Versailles-level luxury. The transformation began with agriculture, because in 18th century Russia, agricultural productivity determined everything else. Catherine couldn't abolish serfdom for political reasons, but she could and did work to improve agricultural methods, introduce new crops, and encourage more efficient land use. She imported agricultural experts from Western Europe, established model farms to demonstrate improved techniques, and offered economic incentives for landowners who adopted more productive methods. The introduction of the potato alone deserves historical recognition as one of Catherine's most practically significant achievements. She overcame traditional resistance to new foods through a combination of education, demonstration, and clever psychology, reportedly posting guards around potato fields during the day, but leaving them unguarded at night, allowing curious peasants to steal and plant what they thought must be valuable if it required such protection. Within a generation, potato cultivation had spread throughout the empire, dramatically improving nutrition and agricultural security. Catherine's approach to manufacturing revealed her sophisticated understanding of how economic development could serve both imperial and humanitarian purposes. She encouraged the establishment of factories and workshops, not just to increase production, but to create alternatives to serf labor, provide opportunities for social mobility, and demonstrate that Russian workers could master complex technical processes. The result was the beginning of Russian industrialization, tentative but genuine progress toward a more diversified economy. The expansion of foreign trade during Catherine's reign transformed Russia's relationship with European commerce and established the economic foundations for her territorial expansion. Russian exports, grain, timber, naval stores, furs, found new markets throughout Europe, generating revenues that funded military campaigns and cultural projects, while demonstrating that Russia could be a reliable commercial partner as well as a formidable military opponent. But Catherine understood that sustainable economic growth required more than just increasing production and expanding markets. She needed to create financial institutions that could manage complex transactions, support long-term investment, and provide the credit mechanisms that modern commerce required. Her establishment of the state bank and other financial institutions began the process of creating a modern Russian banking system. The currency reforms Catherine implemented stabilized Russian money in ways that made complex economic planning possible for the first time. Previous Russian rulers had dealt with financial crises through expedients like debasing coinage or simply printing more money, creating inflation that undermined economic confidence and made long-term investment impossible. Catherine's monetary policies established predictable currency values that encouraged both domestic investment and foreign trade. Urban development during Catherine's reign reflects her understanding that economic modernization required more than just agricultural and manufacturing improvements. It needed physical infrastructure that could support commercial activity and cultural development. She founded new cities, expanded existing ones, and invested heavily in transportation networks that connected remote territories to central markets and administrative centers. The regulation of guilds and merchant organizations shows Catherine balancing traditional economic structures with modernizing pressures. She couldn't simply abolish existing commercial arrangements without disrupting established trade relationships, but she could modify guild regulations to encourage innovation, reduce barriers to entry, and create opportunities for entrepreneurial activity that benefited both individual merchants and the imperial economy. Catherine's economic policies toward religious and ethnic minorities reveal her practical understanding that prosperity required inclusiveness rather than exclusion. She welcomed Jewish merchants, encouraged Armenian traders, and generally created conditions where commercial talent could flourish regardless of traditional social categories. This wasn't just moral enlightenment, it was economic pragmatism that recognized how diversity could enhance rather than threaten imperial prosperity. The development of Black Sea trade following Catherine's territorial conquests demonstrates how military success and economic development could reinforce each other. New ports, expanded shipping, and improved security for commercial transactions transformed the Black Sea from a frontier region into a major commercial zone that connected Russian producers with Mediterranean markets and European trading networks. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine's economic achievements created the fiscal foundations that made her other accomplishments possible. Military campaigns required sustained financing, cultural patronage needed reliable funding, and administrative reforms demanded resources that only a prosperous economy could provide. Without economic success, Catherine's political and cultural achievements would have been impossible to sustain. The economic transformation Catherine accomplished during her reign established patterns that would influence Russian development for generations. She demonstrated that systematic economic reform could improve material conditions without requiring revolutionary social change, that commercial development could strengthen rather than weaken imperial authority, and that economic prosperity and cultural achievement could reinforce each other in ways that benefited both rulers and subjects. History has a tendency to treat powerful women as isolated phenomena, as if they achieved greatness through sheer individual brilliance, while surrounded by passive or hostile females who either supported them unconditionally or opposed them through petty jealousy. Catherine's story reveals how absurd this narrative is. Her reign was shaped by relationships with other remarkable women, whose intelligence, ambition, and political skill matched her own in different but equally impressive ways. Princess Ekaterina Dashkova represents everything remarkable about 18th century female political intelligence, disguised as aristocratic respectability. Born into the highest levels of Russian nobility, Dashkova could have lived comfortably as decorative court furniture, attending balls and producing heirs while leaving politics to men. Instead, she became one of Catherine's most crucial allies during the 1762 coup, coordinating noble support with the kind of strategic brilliance that would make modern campaign managers weep with envy. But Dashkova was more than just a political operator. She was an intellectual powerhouse who corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot as an equal, published philosophical essays that were taken seriously by European thinkers, and eventually became the first woman to serve as director of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Picture the scene: a woman in 18th century Russia, managing the empire's premier intellectual institution, while conducting her own scientific research and maintaining correspondence with the greatest minds of her era. The relationship between Catherine and Dashkova illustrates something fascinating about female political alliances in an era when women's power was always conditional and often threatened. They weren't friends in any simple sense. Their personalities were too different and their ambitions too large for comfortable intimacy. But they recognized in each other the kind of intellectual capacity and political courage that made meaningful collaboration possible, and they maintained that professional respect even when personal affection was strained. Countess Anna Protasova, Catherine's closest female companion during her early years at court, provided a different but equally crucial form of support. Protasova wasn't politically ambitious or intellectually extraordinary, but she offered something Catherine desperately needed during her vulnerable years as Grand Duchess: genuine friendship from someone who asked for nothing in return except loyalty and affection. In a world where every relationship had political implications, Protasova represented the possibility of human connection that wasn't entirely strategic. The story of Catherine's relationship with Maria Choglakova, who served as her official companion during the early years of her marriage, reveals how women in positions of formal powerlessness could still exercise significant influence through careful relationship management. Choglakova was officially responsible for ensuring Catherine's proper behavior and reporting any suspicious activities to Empress Elizabeth. But she gradually became Catherine's ally and confidant, providing crucial information about court politics, while maintaining the appearance of dutiful surveillance. Catherine's correspondences with European women intellectuals, particularly with Madame Geoffrin in Paris, and other salon hostesses, who shaped Enlightenment intellectual culture, demonstrate her understanding that intellectual influence transcended national boundaries and official positions. These women weren't rulers or nobles, but they controlled access to ideas and shaped opinions in ways that made them genuinely powerful. Catherine cultivated these relationships not just for intellectual stimulation, but as part of her broader strategy for international influence. The complex dynamics between Catherine and her various ladies-in-waiting reveal how hierarchical relationships could still involve genuine mutual respect and intellectual exchange. These women weren't just servants. They were educated aristocrats whose opinions Catherine valued and whose social connections provided valuable intelligence about noble attitudes and concerns. The institution of court ladies during Catherine's reign became a kind of informal advisory council, where political information was exchanged through seemingly social interactions. Perhaps most intriguingly, Catherine's relationship with her son Paul's wives, first Natalia Alexeyevna and later Maria Feodorovna, shows how generational differences in female political consciousness played out within the imperial family. These younger women had grown up in a world where Catherine's example made female political authority seem natural, but they also had to navigate the complex dynamics of being subordinate to a mother-in-law who was also an empress with strong opinions about how imperial marriages should function. The women who served as Catherine's rivals and critics deserve recognition for their own forms of political courage. The various noble ladies who whispered about Catherine's foreign birth, questioned her legitimacy, or criticized her policies weren't just engaging in court gossip. They were expressing genuine political opposition in an environment where such opposition could have serious consequences. Their resistance forced Catherine to constantly justify her authority and refine her political strategies. Catherine's policies toward women throughout her empire reveal her understanding that female welfare and imperial prosperity were connected in practical ways. She expanded educational opportunities for noble women, encouraged female participation in cultural activities, and generally worked to create conditions where women's intellectual and artistic talents could be developed and utilized. This wasn't just enlightened social policy, it was recognition that wasting half the empire's human talent was economically and culturally inefficient. The international network of female correspondents Catherine maintained throughout her reign created a kind of informal diplomatic channel that complemented official government relationships. European noble women, writers, and intellectuals provided information about political attitudes, cultural developments, and social changes that formal diplomatic reports often missed. Catherine's letters to these women reveal a different side of her personality, more relaxed, more intellectually playful, more willing to express opinions that wouldn't appear in official documents. What emerges from examining Catherine's relationships with other women is a picture of female political networks that were more sophisticated and influential than traditional historical narratives acknowledge. These weren't just personal friendships or social connections, they were working relationships between intelligent, ambitious women who understood that their individual success depended partly on creating environments where female talent could flourish more generally. Diplomacy in the 18th century was personal in ways that modern international relations have forgotten, and Catherine understood better than most of her contemporaries that successful foreign policy required not just military power and economic leverage, but the ability to make other rulers want to cooperate with her rather than simply forcing them to submit to Russian demands. She transformed Russian diplomacy from crude intimidation into sophisticated persuasion, and she did it largely through the sheer force of her personality projected across the courts of Europe. The transformation began with correspondence, because Catherine grasped something that modern politicians still struggle with. Written communication could create personal relationships that transcended political differences and national interests. Her letters to Voltaire, Frederick the Great, Joseph II of Austria, and other European figures weren't just diplomatic documents but genuine intellectual exchanges that established her reputation as a serious thinker whose opinions deserved consideration independent of her political position. Consider her relationship with Voltaire, which began as mutual curiosity and evolved into something approaching genuine friendship despite the fact that they never met in person. Catherine's letters to Voltaire were masterpieces of intellectual seduction, witty, insightful, politically sophisticated, but also personally revealing in ways that made the old philosopher feel like he was corresponding with a genuine intellectual equal, rather than just another royal patron, seeking reflected glory from association with famous thinkers. Voltaire's letters to Catherine, in turn, provided her with something invaluable, credible endorsement from Europe's most influential public intellectual. When Voltaire praised Catherine's reforms, defended her policies, and generally presented her to European opinion as an enlightened ruler worthy of admiration, rather than just another autocrat worthy of fear, he was providing political capital that military victories alone could never have generated. But Catherine's diplomatic charm wasn't limited to correspondence with famous philosophers. She cultivated personal relationships with European diplomats stationed in St. Petersburg, creating an atmosphere where official negotiations occurred within a context of genuine social interaction and mutual respect. Foreign ambassadors consistently reported that Catherine was not only more intelligent and better informed than they had expected, but also more personally engaging, someone whose company they genuinely enjoyed rather than simply endured as professional obligation. The famous journey Catherine took through her southern provinces in 1787, accompanied by European diplomats and foreign observers, was diplomacy as theatre on a grand scale. She wasn't just showing off Russian territorial gains and administrative improvements. She was demonstrating that Russia, under her rule, had become a modern, prosperous, well-governed state that deserved recognition as a legitimate member of the European community of civilized nations. Whether or not the Potemkin villages were actually as fake as her critics claimed misses the larger point of the exercise. Catherine understood that political perception shapes political reality, and that creating impressive spectacles could influence international opinion more effectively than detailed administrative reports. European diplomats returned home with stories of Russian prosperity, cultural sophistication, and administrative efficiency that challenged traditional assumptions about Russian backwardness and barbarism. Catherine's approach to marriage diplomacy reveals her sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships could serve political purposes without becoming purely cynical calculations. When she arranged marriages between Russian nobles and European aristocrats, she wasn't just cementing political alliances but creating networks of personal loyalty and cultural exchange that made cooperation between Russia and other European powers seem natural rather than forced. The diplomatic revolution Catherine accomplished can be measured in how European attitudes toward Russia changed during her reign. When she came to power, Russia was generally viewed as a large but peripheral power whose military strength was offset by cultural backwardness and administrative incompetence. By the end of her reign, Russia was recognized as one of Europe's great powers, a country whose opinions had to be considered in any major international decision, and whose cultural achievements commanded genuine respect. This transformation wasn't just the result of military victories or territorial expansion. Other Russian rulers had won battles and conquered territories without fundamentally altering European perceptions of Russian civilization. Catherine achieved diplomatic revolution through the accumulated effect of thousands of interactions, letters, conversations, and gestures that gradually convinced European opinion that Russia under her rule had become a genuinely European power, rather than just an Asian empire with European ambitions. Her diplomatic style was particularly effective because it combined genuine intellectual substance with careful attention to European sensibilities and expectations. She didn't try to make Russia seem more European by abandoning Russian traditions. Instead, she presented Russian culture and Russian interests in ways that Europeans could understand and respect, while maintaining distinctly Russian characteristics. The network of diplomatic relationships Catherine established during her reign created foundations for Russian international influence that outlasted her political authority. European rulers who had learned to respect her judgment continued to take Russian interests seriously even after her death, and the cultural connections she had fostered between Russia and the rest of Europe provided channels for continued cooperation and exchange. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine demonstrated that successful diplomacy required more than just negotiating skill or political leverage. It demanded the ability to project an attractive vision of what international cooperation could accomplish. She made other European rulers want to work with Russia not just because they feared Russian power, but because they believed that cooperation with Catherine's Russia could advance their own interests and values. The last decade of Catherine's life reveals something profound about the relationship between power and mortality. that most historical accounts gloss over in their rush toward final assessments and neat conclusions. Catherine spent her final years not just governing an empire, but actively constructing the legacy she wanted to leave, making decisions about succession and continuity, while grappling with the very human reality that even absolute power cannot postpone death indefinitely. By the 1790s, Catherine had accomplished everything she had set out to achieve, and several things she probably never imagined possible when she first arrived in Russia. As a teenage bride, she had transformed a peripheral European power into a major international force, expanded Russian territory to include some of the most valuable agricultural and commercial regions in Eastern Europe, and established cultural institutions that made St. Petersburg a genuine rival to Paris and Vienna as a center of intellectual and artistic achievement. But success at Catherine's level creates its own problems, because great achievements generate great expectations, and every success makes subsequent failures more disappointing to both rulers and subjects. Catherine found herself governing an empire that had grown accustomed to military victories, territorial expansion, and cultural flowering, and maintaining that level of achievement required constant innovation and enormous energy from a woman who was entering her 60s in an era when most people were considered elderly by 50. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, forced Catherine to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between Enlightenment ideals and political stability that she had previously managed to avoid through careful compromise and gradual reform. The spectacle of French revolutionaries executing their king and queen in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity made Catherine realize that the philosophical principles she had enthusiastically promoted could be taken to logical conclusions that threatened everything she had built. Her response to the French Revolution reveals both the pragmatic intelligence and the fundamental conservatism that characterized her entire reign. She couldn't simply abandon the Enlightenment ideals she had genuinely believed in and publicly advocated, but she also couldn't ignore the evidence that revolutionary implementation of those ideals could produce chaos, violence, and social collapse. So she became more cautious about reform, more suspicious of radical rhetoric, and more committed to gradual change that preserved stability while advancing human welfare. The question of succession dominated Catherine's thoughts during her final years in ways that illuminate the tragic isolation that accompanies absolute power. Paul, her son and legal heir, had grown into exactly the kind of ruler Catherine most feared: rigid, militaristic, suspicious of everything she had accomplished, and apparently determined to reverse many of her most important achievements. She considered changing the succession to favor her grandson Alexander, but doing so would have required admitting that her own son was unfit to rule, a judgment that would undermine the entire principle of hereditary monarchy. Catherine's relationship with Platon Zubov, her final lover, who was 40 years younger than she was, became a source of court gossip and international speculation that revealed the impossible position of powerful women who refuse to become sexually invisible as they age. Critics whispered that Catherine was making herself ridiculous by maintaining a romantic relationship with a man young enough to be her grandson, but what they were really criticizing was her refusal to accept the conventional assumption that older women should withdraw from physical and emotional intimacy. The administrative reforms Catherine implemented during her final years show her working to create institutional frameworks that could survive changes in imperial personality and policy preferences. She understood that lasting achievement required more than just good individual decisions. It needed systematic structures that would continue functioning effectively, even under less capable or less enlightened rulers. Her provincial government reforms, judicial improvements, and educational initiatives were designed to outlast her personal authority. Catherine's health began declining noticeably in the early 1790s, but she continued working with the same intensity that had characterized her entire reign, as if she could postpone mortality through sheer productivity. Foreign visitors noted that she still maintained her rigorous daily schedule of administrative work, correspondence, and cultural activities, but they also observed that she tired more easily and seemed increasingly focused on cementing her achievements rather than launching new initiatives. The stroke that killed Catherine on November 17, 1796, was sudden enough that she died without having made final arrangements for the succession crisis she had been contemplating for years. Paul inherited the throne by default rather than by his mother's explicit approval, and he immediately began systematically reversing many of Catherine's policies with the vindictive enthusiasm of someone who had spent decades resenting his exclusion from real political authority. Catherine's death scene, as reported by court observers, captures something essential about her character that explains both her achievements and her contradictions. She reportedly remained conscious long enough to understand that she was dying, but refused to display fear or regret about the life she had lived. Even facing mortality, she maintained the psychological composure that had enabled her to survive court intrigue, military crises, and political challenges that had destroyed lesser rulers. The immediate aftermath of Catherine's death reveals how completely she had dominated Russian political culture during her reign, and how difficult it would be for any successor to maintain the delicate balance of reform and stability that she had achieved. Paul's reactionary policies produced exactly the kind of political instability Catherine had spent decades trying to avoid, validating her concerns about his fitness for rule, while demonstrating how irreplaceable her particular combination of intelligence, pragmatism, and political skill had been. What emerges from examining Catherine's final years is a portrait of someone who understood that true greatness requires not just achieving remarkable things, but creating conditions where those achievements can survive their creator's death. Catherine succeeded partially in this effort. Russian territorial gains, cultural institutions, and administrative improvements outlasted her reign, but she failed to solve the fundamental problem of how enlightened autocracy could perpetuate itself across generational changes in personality and philosophy. The gap between Catherine's historical reputation and Catherine's actual life reveals more about how society processes powerful women than about Catherine herself, because the stories that have attached themselves to her legacy, the sexual excesses, the political ruthlessness, the foreign corruption of Russian purity, tell us exactly what makes people uncomfortable about female authority and how that discomfort gets translated into historical mythology. Let's start with the numbers, because Catherine's supposed sexual promiscuity becomes less scandalous when you realize she had fewer documented lovers during her 34-year reign than most modern celebrities accumulate in a typical Hollywood decade. The commonly cited figure of 12 lovers across more than 3 decades works out to roughly one serious relationship every 3 years, which by 18th century royal standards was practically monastic behavior. Compare Catherine's romantic history to her male contemporaries, and the supposed scandal evaporates entirely. Louis XV of France maintained an official mistress system that required its own administrative bureaucracy, while Frederick the Great's personal relationships were so ambiguous that historians still debate his sexual preferences. Yet somehow Catherine, who maintained relatively discreet long-term relationships with men she genuinely cared about, became history's poster child for royal sexual excess. The horse story, that persistent, ridiculous myth about Catherine's death, deserves special attention, because it illustrates perfectly how misogyny disguises itself as historical anecdote. The story has no basis in fact, contradicts all contemporary accounts of Catherine's death, and serves no purpose except to reduce one of history's most accomplished rulers to a punchline about deviant sexuality. It persists because it allows people to dismiss Catherine's achievements by focusing on fabricated personal scandals instead of actual political accomplishments. What's particularly insidious about the horse myth is how it transforms Catherine's greatest strength, her refusal to be constrained by conventional expectations about female behavior, into evidence of pathological excess. Catherine didn't apologize for having lovers, didn't hide her relationships, and didn't pretend that powerful women should be sexually invisible. This honesty about human desires was revolutionary in the 18th century, and apparently remains threatening enough today that people still prefer salacious fiction to historical reality. The accusations of political ruthlessness that follow Catherine through historical accounts become equally questionable when examined against the standards of her era and the actual methods she employed to maintain power. Yes, Catherine orchestrated a military coup to remove her husband from the throne, but she did so with remarkably little violence, and with broader support from Russian nobility, military and church than most legitimate successions could claim. Catherine's treatment of political opponents was notably more lenient than the norm for 18th century autocrats. She exiled rather than executed most critics, allowed former enemies to return to court if they demonstrated loyalty, and generally preferred co-optation to elimination as a method for dealing with potential threats. Her response to the Pugachev rebellion, while certainly harsh by modern standards, was restrained compared to how other European rulers dealt with similar challenges. The persistent criticism of Catherine as a foreign ruler reveals the xenophobic assumptions underlying much historical commentary about her reign. Catherine was German by birth, but she became more authentically Russian than many native-born rulers, mastering the language, embracing Orthodox theology, and demonstrating genuine commitment to Russian interests and Russian culture. Yet critics continued to characterize her policies as foreign corruption of Russian traditions, as if effectiveness in governance somehow became suspect when practiced by someone born outside the empire. This foreignness narrative conveniently ignores how many other successful Russian rulers were also born outside Russia, or heavily influenced by non-Russian cultural traditions. The entire Romanov dynasty had significant foreign connections, and Russian culture during Catherine's era was already thoroughly internationalized through contact with European intellectual and artistic movements. Catherine's German birth was less significant than her Russian achievements, but focusing on origins rather than accomplishments allows critics to avoid confronting the substance of her success. The economic criticisms of Catherine's reign, that her cultural patronage was wasteful luxury, that her territorial expansion was expensive imperialism, that her administrative reforms were inefficient bureaucracy, similarly dissolve when examined against actual results. Catherine's investments in culture, military and administration produced measurable returns in terms of international prestige, territorial security and governmental effectiveness that justified their costs by any reasonable standard. Modern reassessments of Catherine's reign have begun correcting these distorted narratives, but the persistence of myths and misconceptions reveals how difficult it remains for society to process female political achievement without reducing it to personal scandal or dismissing it as somehow illegitimate. Catherine succeeded as a ruler by exactly the same methods that made male rulers successful: intelligence, pragmatism, strategic thinking, and effective use of available resources. But those same methods are somehow viewed as more questionable when employed by a woman. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Catherine's distorted reputation is how it reflects anxiety about female sexual autonomy, rather than legitimate concerns about political governance. The same historical accounts that breathlessly catalogue Catherine's lovers barely mention the lovers of male rulers, suggesting that the real scandal wasn't sexual activity but sexual activity by a woman who refused to apologize for her desires or subordinate them to conventional expectations about female behavior. Catherine's actual legacy: territorial expansion, cultural achievement, administrative reform, and international influence, speaks for itself without requiring defense against fabricated scandals or invented moral failings. She was neither saint nor monster, but something more interesting and more historically significant: a remarkably capable ruler who happened to be a woman and who refused to allow gender expectations to limit her political effectiveness or personal autonomy. When historians discuss Catherine's legacy, they typically focus on territorial gains, cultural achievements, and administrative reforms, the concrete, measurable outcomes that make for neat historical assessments. But Catherine's most revolutionary contribution to human civilization was subtler and more profound. She demonstrated that female political authority could be not just tolerated as an unfortunate necessity, but embraced as a positive good that enhanced rather than threatened effective governance. Consider the situation Catherine inherited in 1762. A throne she had seized through military coup, a nobility suspicious of her foreign birth, an unconventional path to power, international observers waiting for evidence that a woman couldn't handle the complex demands of governing a major European empire. Every decision she made was scrutinized for proof that female rule was inherently inferior to male authority. Every mistake was cited as evidence of gender-based incompetence. Every success had to overcome assumptions that women were naturally unsuited for political leadership. Catherine's response wasn't to minimize her femininity or apologize for her gender, but to redefine what effective leadership could look like when practiced by someone who refused to be constrained by traditional masculine models of authority. She governed through persuasion as well as command, built consensus while maintaining clear lines of authority, and demonstrated that political success could be achieved through intellectual sophistication and cultural patronage, as well as military conquest and administrative efficiency. The networks of female relationships Catherine cultivated throughout her reign created new possibilities for women's political participation that extended far beyond the imperial court. Princess Dashkova's appointment as director of the Russian Academy of Sciences wasn't just personal favoritism, but a statement that intellectual leadership could be exercised by women whose qualifications transcended gender categories. Catherine's correspondence with European women intellectuals demonstrated that serious political and philosophical discussion could occur between female participants as equals rather than as exceptions to male-dominated discourse. Perhaps most significantly, Catherine's approach to combining personal autonomy with political responsibility created a template for how powerful women could maintain private lives without compromising public effectiveness. She didn't segregate her romantic relationships from her political work or pretend that personal happiness was incompatible with governmental duty. Instead, she integrated all aspects of her life into a coherent pattern where emotional fulfillment, intellectual stimulation, and political achievement reinforced rather than conflicted with each other. This integration challenged fundamental assumptions about how power should be exercised, and how personal and political authority should relate to each other. Male rulers had always maintained complex personal lives while governing, but they did so within established patterns that separated public duty from private pleasure. Catherine created new patterns that demonstrated how personal authenticity and political effectiveness could enhance each other when practiced by someone with sufficient intelligence and strategic skill. The international impact of Catherine's reign extended beyond Russia's borders in ways that influenced European attitudes toward female political capacity more generally. European rulers who had initially viewed Catherine's success as an anomaly gradually recognized that her achievements reflected genuine governing ability rather than favorable circumstances or masculine advisors operating behind the scenes. This recognition created precedents for taking women's political opinions seriously and including female perspectives in international diplomatic calculations. Catherine's educational and cultural policies established institutional foundations for women's intellectual development that outlasted her personal authority, and created opportunities for subsequent generations of Russian women to participate in cultural and intellectual life on terms that would have been unimaginable before her reign. The schools she founded, the intellectual salons she encouraged, and the general atmosphere of cultural sophistication she promoted made it possible for women to develop and exercise talents that previous eras had systematically suppressed or ignored. The economic policies Catherine implemented demonstrated that attention to domestic welfare and social development could be compatible with international military success and territorial expansion, challenging assumptions that effective rulers had to choose between internal improvement and external achievement. Her reign proved that comprehensive governance, addressing multiple aspects of social, economic, cultural, and political development simultaneously, could produce better results than narrow focus on traditional masculine priorities like military conquest or administrative control. But Catherine's most lasting contribution may be the simple fact that she succeeded so completely that female political authority became imaginable in ways it hadn't been before. After Catherine, the idea that a woman might govern effectively was no longer theoretical speculation, but demonstrated historical reality. This precedent didn't immediately transform European attitudes toward female leadership, but it established proof of concept that would influence subsequent arguments about women's political capacity. The methods Catherine developed for maintaining authority while implementing reform created models for how political change could be achieved through evolutionary, rather than revolutionary processes, how traditional institutions could be modernized without being destroyed, and how autocratic power could be exercised in ways that advanced rather than hindered human welfare and cultural development. Modern feminist analysis of Catherine's reign reveals both the achievements and limitations of her approach to female empowerment. She succeeded in demonstrating female political competence and creating opportunities for other women's advancement, but she did so within existing power structures rather than challenging the fundamental assumptions that made such demonstrations necessary. Her success was individual rather than systematic, exceptional rather than normative. Nevertheless, Catherine's reign established that female political authority was not just possible, but potentially superior to male alternatives, when exercised by someone with appropriate intelligence, preparation, and strategic skill. This recognition created intellectual and political foundations for subsequent arguments about women's political rights and capabilities that continue to influence contemporary debates about gender and governance. History remembers Catherine as the Empress who expanded Russia and collected lovers with equal enthusiasm. But the private woman behind the public persona was far more complex and vulnerable than her carefully constructed imperial image suggested. Understanding Catherine's inner life, her fears, doubts, genuine emotions, and psychological strategies for managing the impossible pressures of absolute power reveals how extraordinary achievements often emerge from very human struggles with loneliness, insecurity, and the constant tension between personal desires and public responsibilities. Catherine's personal writings, particularly her memoirs and private correspondence, reveal someone who understood that maintaining imperial authority required performing confidence and competence even when she felt neither. The young German princess who had arrived in Russia with minimal preparation for imperial responsibility had to teach herself not just how to govern an empire, but how to project the psychological authority that made governance possible. This was method acting on a historical scale, and the performance had to be maintained 24 hours a day for 34 years. The loneliness that accompanied Catherine's position becomes apparent in her relationships with people who could offer genuine friendship rather than strategic alliance. Her correspondence with Voltaire, for example, reveals someone desperately hungry for intellectual connection with an Anine who wasn't seeking political favor or personal advancement. Catherine's letters to the French philosopher are more relaxed, more personally revealing, and more emotionally honest than almost any other documents from her reign, suggesting how rare it was for her to find relationships where she could be herself rather than performing the role of Empress. Catherine's approach to motherhood illustrates the painful personal costs of political authority for women in ways that male rulers rarely experienced. Her relationship with Paul was complicated by the fact that Empress Elizabeth had essentially kidnapped him at birth and raised him as her own heir, but it was further damaged by Catherine's recognition that Paul's personality and political instincts made him unsuited for the kind of enlightened governance she had spent her life implementing. The tragedy of watching her son grow into exactly the kind of ruler she most feared reveals the impossible position of powerful mothers whose personal and political legacies might be destroyed by their own children. The question of Paul's paternity, whether his biological father was Peter III, Sergei Saltykov, or someone else entirely, mattered less to Catherine than the growing evidence that Paul's political attitudes would threaten everything she had accomplished. Her consideration of changing the succession to favor her grandson Alexander wasn't just political calculation, but maternal anguish about how to protect both her empire and her family from the consequences of Paul's potential misrule. Catherine's romantic relationships provided not just sexual fulfillment but emotional sustenance that helped her manage the psychological isolation of absolute power. Her lovers weren't just chosen for physical attraction or political utility, though both factors were certainly considered, but for their ability to provide genuine companionship and intellectual stimulation. The longevity of many of these relationships, particularly with Grigory Orlov and Grigory Potemkin, suggest that Catherine valued emotional consistency and personal loyalty as much as passion or convenience. The age difference between Catherine and Platon Zubov, her final lover, became a source of court gossip and international criticism that reveals how society's discomfort with female sexual autonomy intensified when combined with anxieties about aging and appropriate behavior for older women. Catherine's refusal to become sexually invisible as she aged was perhaps her most personally courageous act, requiring her to ignore not just public criticism but her own awareness that maintaining romantic relationships with much younger men made her vulnerable to ridicule and accusations of impropriety. Catherine's intellectual life provided refuge from political pressures in ways that reveal both her genuine love of learning and her sophisticated understanding of how knowledge could serve as both personal enrichment and political resource. Her reading was voracious and systematic: philosophy, literature, history, science, but it was also clearly therapeutic, offering mental stimulation and emotional satisfaction that official duties rarely provided. Her books were companions as well as sources of information, relationships with great minds that transcended the limitations of court society and diplomatic necessity. The health problems that increasingly affected Catherine during her final years forced her to confront mortality in ways that absolute power couldn't prevent or postpone. Contemporary accounts describe someone who maintained her public schedule and official responsibilities while privately dealing with the physical deterioration that reminded her daily of human limitation and the temporary nature of even the greatest achievements. Her determination to continue working despite declining health reveals both admirable dedication and the psychological difficulty of accepting that even empresses must eventually relinquish control. Catherine's awareness that her reign might be followed by policies that reversed her reforms created a form of anticipatory grief that colored her final years with melancholy. Despite her continued public success, she had devoted her adult life to implementing Enlightenment ideals through gradual, systematic reform, but she couldn't guarantee that future rulers would maintain either her methods or her objectives. The prospect that Paul might undo her achievements was more distressing than any political opposition she had faced during her active reign. The religious questions that Catherine grappled with throughout her life reveal someone whose public orthodox piety coexisted with private philosophical skepticism in ways that created ongoing internal tension. She had converted to orthodoxy for political reasons, but she seems to have developed genuine spiritual interests that were complicated by her intellectual commitment to Enlightenment rationalism. Her private spiritual life appears to have been more questioning and less certain than her public religious observances suggested. Perhaps most poignantly, Catherine's private writings reveal someone who understood that historical judgment would focus on her public achievements, while largely ignoring the personal costs of maintaining the psychological composure that made those achievements possible. She knew that future generations would remember the Empress who expanded Russia and patronized culture, while forgetting the woman who sacrificed normal human relationships, family intimacy, and personal security to create and maintain the authority that made imperial success possible. Every generation reinvents Catherine according to its own anxieties and aspirations, creating versions of her story that reveal more about contemporary attitudes toward power, gender, and leadership than about 18th century Russian history. The Catherine who emerges from Soviet historiography is different from the Catherine of 19th century romantic biography, who differs again from the Catherine of contemporary feminist analysis, and understanding these differences tells us something crucial about how societies construct meaning from historical examples. The Romantic era transformed Catherine into a figure of exotic sensuality and imperial grandeur, emphasizing her love affairs and cultural patronage, while downplaying the systematic political intelligence that made both possible. This version of Catherine served 19th century needs for stories about passionate, larger-than-life figures who transcended ordinary moral constraints through sheer force of personality, but it obscured the careful calculation and strategic patience that characterized her actual approach to governance and personal relationships. Soviet historians faced a particular challenge in processing Catherine's legacy, because her achievements were undeniably significant, but her methods were incompatible with Marxist theories about class struggle and revolutionary progress. The solution was to emphasize her role in modernizing Russia, while criticizing her failure to address fundamental social inequalities, creating a Catherine who was historically progressive within the limitations of her class position, but ultimately constrained by the aristocratic interests she represented. Contemporary feminist analysis has reclaimed Catherine as an example of female political competence, while grappling with the uncomfortable reality that her success occurred within patriarchal power structures that she modified rather than challenged. This creates a Catherine who demonstrates what exceptional women could achieve when they refuse to accept conventional limitations while raising questions about whether individual female success within existing systems advances or retards broader gender equality. The persistence of myths about Catherine's sexual excess reveals ongoing cultural anxieties about female authority and sexual autonomy that have little to do with historical accuracy. The same societies that celebrate male rulers' military conquests and political achievements become obsessed with female rulers' private lives and romantic relationships, suggesting that powerful women continue to be perceived as fundamentally transgressive in ways that require explanation or justification through personal scandal. Modern leadership studies have discovered Catherine as a case study in effective governance, focusing on her methods for managing complex organizations, implementing systematic reform, and maintaining authority while delegating responsibility. This version of Catherine appeals to contemporary management theory because it demonstrates how strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and cultural sophistication can produce better results than traditional command and control approaches to organizational leadership. But perhaps the most important reason Catherine still matters is what her story reveals about the relationship between individual agency and historical circumstances. Catherine succeeded not because she was uniquely gifted or because conditions were particularly favorable, but because she understood how to analyze complex situations, identify available opportunities, and implement strategies that advanced her objectives while adapting to changing circumstances. These are learnable skills rather than innate talents, and Catherine's example demonstrates how systematic intelligence can overcome apparent disadvantages. Catherine's approach to combining idealism with pragmatism offers lessons for contemporary leaders who must balance moral principles with political realities in ways that advance human welfare without triggering backlash that undermines long-term progress. Her reign demonstrates how incremental reform can achieve substantial change when implemented systematically over extended periods, and how apparent compromises can serve larger strategic objectives when understood within broader contexts. The international dimension of Catherine's success provides insights into how effective leaders can build influence through cultural attraction and intellectual persuasion, rather than relying exclusively on economic leverage or military threat. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers, patronage of arts and sciences, and generally sophisticated approach to public relations created soft power that complemented and amplified her hard power in ways that purely military or economic strategies could never have accomplished. Catherine's example also illustrates how effective leadership requires integrating multiple forms of intelligence, analytical, emotional, cultural, strategic, in ways that produce comprehensive, rather than narrowly focused solutions to complex problems. Her reign succeeded because she understood that military, economic, cultural, and diplomatic policies had to reinforce rather than conflict with each other, and that sustainable achievement required attention to all dimensions of governance, rather than specializing in particular areas. Most significantly, Catherine's story demonstrates that transformative leadership is possible even within constrained circumstances, when practitioners understand how to work systematically toward long-term objectives, while managing short-term pressures and opposition. She inherited a throne through circumstances she didn't control, but she created a legacy through decisions she made consciously and strategically over decades of careful implementation. The fact that Catherine's achievements were accomplished by someone who started with minimal advantages, foreign birth, questionable legitimacy, limited preparation, hostile environment, makes her example particularly relevant for contemporary leaders who must overcome significant obstacles to achieve meaningful progress. Her success wasn't inevitable or predetermined, but resulted from systematic application of intelligence, persistence, and strategic flexibility to challenging circumstances. Contemporary relevance isn't just about drawing inspirational lessons from historical success stories, but about understanding how intelligent, determined individuals can navigate complex systems to produce positive change, even when those systems seem resistant to improvement. Catherine's reign provides a template for how this kind of systematic change can be accomplished without requiring revolutionary disruption or ideal conditions for implementation. As we reach the end of Catherine's remarkable story, it becomes clear that her true immortality lies not in the territories she conquered or the palaces she built, but in the ideas she proved possible and the precedents she established for how power could be exercised with intelligence, purpose, and genuine commitment to human flourishing. Catherine didn't just rule Russia for 34 years, she expanded the definition of what successful leadership could look like when practiced by someone who refused to accept limitations others considered inevitable. The Russia Catherine left behind in 1796 was fundamentally different from the country she had inherited in 1762, transformed not just in size and wealth, but in its relationship to European civilization and its conception of its own possibilities. She had taken a peripheral power and made it central to European politics, taken a culturally isolated empire and made it a center of intellectual and artistic achievement, taken an autocracy and demonstrated how absolute power could serve enlightenment rather than merely personal or dynastic interests. But Catherine's influence extended far beyond Russian borders, creating ripple effects that influenced European attitudes toward governance, culture, and the possibilities for systematic social improvement. Her correspondence with Enlightenment thinkers helped bridge the gap between theoretical philosophy and practical implementation, demonstrating how abstract ideals could be translated into concrete policies that improved real people's lives while maintaining political stability and international respect. The educational institutions Catherine established, the cultural traditions she encouraged, and the administrative innovations she implemented, created foundations for Russian development that continue to influence the empire long after her death. The universities, academies, hospitals, and other institutions she founded provided infrastructure for intellectual and cultural advancement that made possible the flowering of Russian literature, science, and art that would make the 19th century a golden age of Russian cultural achievement. Catherine's approach to international relations, combining military strength with cultural attraction, diplomatic sophistication with clear strategic objectives, created models for how major powers could exercise global influence through comprehensive rather than purely coercive methods. Her understanding that lasting international influence required respect as well as fear anticipated modern concepts of soft power and demonstrated how cultural diplomacy could complement rather than replace traditional military and economic leverage. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine proved that exceptional individual achievement was possible within existing systems, when practitioners understood how to work systematically toward comprehensive reform, rather than accepting incremental changes or waiting for ideal conditions. Her reign demonstrated that transformative leadership didn't require perfect circumstances, but did require sustained intelligence, strategic patience, and genuine commitment to advancing human welfare, alongside personal and national interests. The personal qualities that made Catherine's success possible: intellectual curiosity, emotional resilience, strategic flexibility, cultural sophistication, remain relevant models for contemporary leaders facing complex challenges that require comprehensive rather than specialized solutions. Her example shows how effective leadership emerges from integrating multiple forms of intelligence and maintaining long-term perspective while managing immediate pressures and opposition. Catherine's story also reveals the ongoing relevance of Enlightenment ideals, when applied with practical wisdom and strategic intelligence rather than abstract idealism or revolutionary impatience. Her reign demonstrates how reason, tolerance, and systematic reform can produce meaningful progress when implemented gradually and comprehensively rather than imposed dramatically or maintained theoretically without practical application. The myths and misconceptions that continue to surround Catherine's legacy reflect ongoing cultural anxieties about female authority, political power, and the relationship between personal autonomy and public responsibility that remain unresolved in contemporary society. Understanding how and why these myths persist provides insights into current attitudes toward leadership, gender, and the expectations societies place on individuals who achieve exceptional influence and authority. Modern reassessment of Catherine's achievements suggests that her most lasting contribution may be demonstrating how individual excellence can serve broader human progress when exercised with strategic intelligence and genuine commitment to advancing civilization, rather than merely personal, narrow institutional interests. Her reign provides evidence that transformative leadership is possible within existing systems when practitioners understand how to work comprehensively toward long-term objectives. The fact that Catherine accomplished so much while starting with so little: foreign birth, questionable legitimacy, minimal preparation, hostile environment, makes her example particularly relevant for understanding how determined intelligence can overcome apparent disadvantages through systematic effort and strategic adaptation to available opportunities. Her success wasn't inevitable, but resulted from conscious decisions made consistently over decades of dedicated implementation. As we close this exploration of Catherine's extraordinary life, perhaps the most important lesson is that greatness isn't reserved for people born into ideal circumstances or blessed with exceptional natural advantages, but is available to anyone willing to combine systematic intelligence with genuine commitment to advancing human welfare and cultural achievement. Catherine's story proves that transformative leadership emerges from conscious decision-making rather than favorable conditions, and that lasting influence results from sustained effort rather than momentary inspiration. Catherine the Great died as she had lived on her own terms, having created exactly the legacy she intended to leave. She remains, more than 2 centuries after her death, a permanent reminder that individual excellence can serve universal human progress when exercised with intelligent dedication and strategic understanding of how complex systems can be modified to advance, rather than obstruct human flourishing and civilizational development. Still here after 17,000 words about an 18th century German princess who stole a Russian throne and redefined what greatness could look like. Then you understand why Catherine's story isn't just history, it's a blueprint for how intelligent, determined individuals can change the world when they refuse to accept limitations others consider permanent. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to stay in your assigned lane.